On June 3, 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor jolted America into World War II, Japanese carrier-based bombers appeared in the skies over Dutch Harbor, Alaska, and for the next 3 days, they systematically bombed American military installations on U.S. soil. 4 days later, on June 7th, Japanese troops landed on the islands of Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Chain and raised the Rising Sun flag over American territory. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign military forces occupied United States land. But here's what almost no one remembers. The Japanese stayed for over a year. Kiska wasn't liberated until August 15, 1943, 433 days of occupation. And during that entire time, the vast majority of Alaska's 6,640-mile coastline, a distance longer than the entire United States Atlantic seaboard, was defended not by the U.S. military, which had pulled the Alaska National Guard out of the territory just 4 months before Pearl Harbor, but by indigenous volunteers who had never worn a uniform, never fired a military weapon, and who served completely without pay. They were called the Alaska Territorial Guard, though history would remember them by the nickname that reflected both their origins and America's casual racism, the Eskimo Scouts. They ranged in age from 12 to 80 years old. They came from 107 remote villages scattered across one of the harshest environments on Earth. They patrolled in temperatures that dropped to 60 below zero, traveled by dog sled across hundreds of miles of frozen tundra, and kept watch over beaches where Japanese submarines surfaced to question locals, where enemy aircraft flew reconnaissance missions, and where, in the war's final year, thousands of incendiary balloon bombs launched from Japan drifted across the Pacific on the jet stream, landing in forests and fields designed to burn America to the ground. More than 6,300 Alaska natives, Inupiat, Yupik, Aleut, Athabaskan, Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, and others answered the call when their own government had abandoned them to defend themselves. They protected America's only source of platinum in the Western Hemisphere. They secured the Lend-Lease air route that supplied vital aircraft to the Soviet Union. They created survival caches along transportation routes that would save the lives of downed pilots. They built fake cannons from barrels and logs to fool Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. They enforced blackouts across entire villages to prevent enemy targeting. And they did it all while knowing that their relatives on the Aleutian Islands, the Unangoks people, had been forcibly evacuated by the U.S. government and imprisoned in abandoned fish canneries and mine buildings in southeast Alaska, where approximately 100 of the 881 detainees would die from disease, cold, and neglect before war's end. This is the story of the Alaska Territorial Guard, a story that's been marginalized, footnoted, almost erased from American World War II history because it didn't fit the narrative of heroic military campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. But make no mistake, these indigenous defenders were America's first and often only line of defense across thousands of miles of territory that Japan wanted to use as a stepping stone to invade the mainland United States and cut off American aid to the Soviet Union. When foreign troops occupied American soil, when the U.S. military didn't have the resources or the will to defend the far north, when Alaska was written off as Seward's folly, even as Japanese forces literally walked on U.S. beaches, it was native Alaskans, armed with old rifles, traditional survival skills, and an intimate knowledge of land the U.S. Army couldn't begin to comprehend, who became the shield that protected America's northern frontier. And for 58 years after the war ended, the United States government refused to recognize them as veterans. If stories of forgotten heroes defending America inspire you, subscribe and tell us in the comments which Indigenous warriors' stories need to be told. To understand the Alaska Territorial Guard, you first have to understand what Alaska was in 1941, a forgotten, underestimated, virtually defenseless territory that most Americans viewed as a frozen wasteland with no strategic value whatsoever. When Secretary of State William Seward negotiated the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million, about 2 cents per acre, newspapers across America mocked it as Seward's folly and Seward's icebox. Even after gold was discovered in the Klondike in 1896 and Nome in 1898, even after Alaska proved to be rich in natural resources, the prevailing American attitude remained. Alaska was too remote, too hostile, too expensive to defend, and certainly not worth military investment. By 1941, on the eve of America's entry into World War II, Alaska's military presence was laughable. The entire territory was defended by approximately 300 soldiers stationed at Chilkoot Barracks near Haines. The Army had inherited some relic coastal artillery pieces from the Russian era that were obsolete before World War I. The territory had 6 operational military aircraft and 1 rudimentary radio station. The Aleutian Islands, which stretched like stepping stones across the Pacific toward Japan, had virtually no military presence at all. The U.S. military's assessment was clear. Japan would have no interest in Alaska. It was too far away, too difficult to supply, too harsh to occupy. Alaska was deemed strategically irrelevant. This assessment was catastrophically wrong, and one man in particular knew it. Major Marvin Muktuk Marston, an Alaska National Guard officer who had lived in Alaska since the early 1900s and understood both its strategic importance and its vulnerability. But Marston's warnings went unheeded. In August 1941, just 4 months before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army actually withdrew the Alaska National Guard from Alaska and redeployed these units to Washington State. The logic was that they were needed for training and could always be sent back if necessary. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Alaska was essentially defenseless, and Japan was paying attention. The Japanese attack on Alaska wasn't impulsive, it was strategic. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood Alaska's value in ways American planners did not. Control of the Aleutian Islands would prevent the United States and Soviet Union from coordinating attacks on Japan via the Kuril Islands. It would threaten the Lend-Lease air route that was supplying vital aircraft to the Soviets. It would force the U.S. to divert resources to defend a territory it had neglected. And it would provide a potential staging ground for further attacks on the U.S. West Coast. On June 3, 1942, Japanese carrier-based bombers appeared over Dutch Harbor, a U.S. naval base on Unalaska Island in the Aleutians. For 3 days, they conducted systematic bombing raids. The attacks killed 43 Americans, destroyed numerous aircraft and facilities, and sent shockwaves through the U.S. military command. But the bombing was just a diversion for the real objective. On June 7, 1942, Japanese forces landed unopposed on Attu Island, the westernmost island in the Aleutian chain, and on Kiska, an island with a small U.S. weather station. The Japanese captured the entire civilian population of Attu, 42 Unanaks people, and transported them to Japan, where they would be held as prisoners of war for the duration of the conflict. Only 24 would survive to return home after the war. For the first time since British forces burned Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812, foreign military troops occupied U.S. territory. The American public was largely kept in the dark about this humiliating fact. Newspapers were censored and the story was downplayed. But in Alaska, everyone knew the Japanese were here on American soil, and they weren't leaving. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over Alaskan villages. Japanese submarines surfaced off the coast to question locals about the economy and military presence. Enemy vessels were spotted in the Bering Sea with increasing frequency. The fear in Alaska's population was palpable. What if the Japanese pushed further? What if they took more islands? What if they landed on the mainland? The U.S. military scrambled to respond, but the logistical challenges were enormous. Alaska was thousands of miles from major U.S. military bases. Supply lines were tenuous, the weather was brutal, the terrain was unforgiving, and crucially, the U.S. Army had almost no understanding of how to operate in the Arctic environment, how to survive in the extreme cold, how to navigate the vast distances, or how to utilize the land itself as both ally and weapon. The indigenous people of Alaska knew all of this. It was their home. Their ancestors had lived there for thousands of years, surviving and thriving in conditions that would kill outsiders within hours. They knew how to travel in winter when the snow was too deep for vehicles. They knew how to read the weather, how to find food, how to build shelters, how to navigate without roads or maps. They were expert marksmen, seasoned hunters, experienced trackers. And many of them were terrified that their home was about to become a battlefield. One man saw an opportunity in this crisis, Major Marvin Muktuk Marston.
Marvin Marston was not a typical Army officer. Born in Oregon in 1896, he had moved to Alaska in his 20s and spent decades there, working in mining, becoming fluent in several indigenous languages, and developing deep relationships with native communities across the territory. His nickname, Muktuk, which refers to whale skin and blubber eaten raw, a traditional indigenous food, came from an eating contest. It was a mark of respect from the native community, and Marston wore it with pride. By 1941, Marston was serving in the Alaska National Guard with the rank of major. When he heard that the National Guard was being pulled out of Alaska in August 1941, he was alarmed. When Pearl Harbor was attacked 4 months later, he was proven right to worry. And when the Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor and occupied Attu and Kiska, Marston knew exactly what needed to happen. Alaska's indigenous people needed to be organized, armed, and empowered to defend their own homeland. Marston had a specific moment of clarity while visiting St. Lawrence Island in the Bering Sea after the Dutch Harbor attack. He met with Siberian Yupik residents who were terrified of what was coming. These people knew the sea, knew the weather, knew every inch of their island. They could see Japanese aircraft overhead. They could hear enemy vessels in the distance. They wanted to help defend their homes, but they had no organization, no supplies, no connection to the U.S. military. Marston immediately conceived a plan: create a home guard composed entirely of local residents, primarily indigenous Alaskans, who would serve as the eyes and ears of the military across Alaska's vast coastline. They wouldn't replace regular military units, those were desperately needed for offensive operations, but they would provide intelligence, conduct patrols, defend key locations, and use their traditional skills to operate in environments where conventional military forces would struggle. Initially, Marston's superiors in the Army were skeptical. Use indigenous people with no military training as defenders of U.S. territory? Give rifles to civilians, including teenagers and elderly men? The whole idea seemed unorthodox, potentially dangerous, and administratively complicated. But Marston found an ally in Ernest Gruening, the governor of Alaska Territory. Gruening had been searching for a way to organize territorial defense after the National Guard was pulled out. He had political connections in Washington and understood the gravity of the situation. When Marston presented his plan, Gruening immediately endorsed it and used his influence to get approval from the War Department. On June 28, 1942, just 3 weeks after the Japanese occupied Attu and Kiska, the Alaska Territorial Guard, or ATG, was officially authorized. Major Marston was placed in command with orders to recruit,
train, and organize a territorial defense force as quickly as possible. Marston didn't wait for paperwork or bureaucracy. He immediately set out on what would become one of the most remarkable recruitment missions in American military history.
The recruitment of the Alaska Territorial Guard is a story in itself, one that perfectly captures both the challenges of operating in Alaska and the extraordinary commitment of Major Marston. Marston's plan was to travel to indigenous villages across Alaska, meet with community leaders, explain the mission, and recruit volunteers. The War Department had promised to provide air transport to help him reach remote communities quickly. But when Marston arrived at his first staging point, ready to begin recruitment in winter 1942-43, the promised aircraft never showed up. After waiting a week with no word on when or if the plane would arrive, Marston made a decision that would define the entire ATG effort. He would go by dog sled. Marston set out on a 680-mile journey around the Seward Peninsula during what locals said was the coldest winter in 25 years. Traveling by dog sled through temperatures that plummeted to 60 below zero, sleeping in snow shelters, and surviving using traditional indigenous methods taught to him by his guide, Sammy Mogg, Marston visited village after village, delivering the same message: Alaska needs you. Your country needs you. Will you defend your homeland? The response was overwhelming. In village after village, men volunteered, and so did women, though they would often have to fight for the right to be officially recognized. Teenagers lied about their ages to sign up. Elderly men in their 70s and 80s insisted they could still shoot straight and wanted to help. Traditional rivals from different communities agreed to serve together. People who had every reason to distrust the U.S. government, which had systematically tried to destroy their cultures, languages, and ways of life for decades, stepped forward to defend American territory. Why? The answers were complex and varied by individual and community. Some saw it as defending their ancestral homelands against foreign invasion. They weren't defending America, they were defending their home. Some saw military service as a path to respect and recognition. Some simply wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. Many were motivated by a mix of all these factors. By early 1943, Marston and his team of organizers had recruited over 6,300 volunteers from 107 communities across Alaska. The ATG became one of the first racially integrated military units in U.S. history, with Indigenous Alaskans from multiple ethnic groups, Inupiat, Yupik, Kupik, Aleut/Anangoks, Athabaskan, Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, and others, serving alongside non-Indigenous Alaskans. It also became one of the first gender-integrated units. While the official count would later state at least 27 women served, the actual number was likely higher. These women served as scouts, radio men, the term used at the time, and in other capacities, with at least one documented as outperforming male members in marksmanship tests. The age range was extraordinary, from 12-year-old boys in sparsely populated areas where every able body was needed, to 80-year-old elders who insisted their lifetime of experience made them valuable. The average age of volunteers was probably late teens to early 20s, but the ATG's willingness to accept anyone who could contribute made it unique among U.S. military forces. And here's the most remarkable part. Of those 6,300-plus volunteers, only 21 were paid positions, officers and organizers like Marston. Everyone else served completely without pay. The War Department classified them as volunteers, not active-duty military, which meant no salary, no benefits, no military pensions. They served purely out of commitment to defending their homes. What exactly did the Alaska Territorial Guard do? Their mission was multifaceted and crucial to Alaska's defense throughout the war. Primary mission number 1, protecting America's platinum. The village of Platinum, Alaska, south of Kwethluk in southwestern Alaska, contained the only source of platinum in the Western Hemisphere. Platinum was absolutely critical for the war effort. It was used in laboratory equipment, catalytic converters, electrical contacts, and various chemical processes essential to weapons production. Loss of the platinum mine would have forced the United States to depend entirely on uncertain foreign sources. ATG units were responsible for the security of platinum and ensuring the mine could continue operations without Japanese interdiction. This was not a hypothetical concern. Japanese forces had already demonstrated they could land on Alaskan soil, and a raid on the platinum mine would have been a devastating blow to American war production. Primary mission number 2, securing the Lend-Lease route. One of the most important strategic developments of World War II was the Lend-Lease program, through which the United States supplied aircraft and equipment to the Soviet Union. The most direct route for delivering these aircraft was through Alaska. Planes would be flown from U.S. factories to Alaska, then Soviet pilots would fly them across the Bering Strait to Siberia and on to the Eastern Front. This air route passed directly through areas where the ATG operated. Japanese forces understood the route's importance and desperately wanted to disrupt it. The ATG's presence, thousands of observers scattered across the territory, made it nearly impossible for Japanese forces to move undetected or establish bases from which to attack the air route. Primary mission number 3, coastal surveillance and intelligence. With over 6,640 miles of coastline to monitor and virtually no Navy presence, the ATG became the primary source of intelligence on Japanese naval movements, aircraft reconnaissance, submarine sightings, and attempted landings. ATG members were instructed to report anything unusual: unidentified vessels, aircraft that didn't follow normal patterns, strangers asking questions, suspicious activity of any kind. They maintained constant vigilance, often in the most remote and harsh conditions imaginable. Villages implemented complete blackouts to prevent Japanese aircraft from identifying targets. Windows were covered so thoroughly that no light could be seen from outside. Anyone violating blackout protocols was reported immediately. A single light could guide enemy bombers to populated areas. Secondary missions, survival caches, and emergency response. The ATG established survival caches along vital transportation routes and in remote areas where pilots might be forced to land in emergencies. These caches contained food, fuel, medical supplies, ammunition, and survival gear. They were regularly checked and restocked by ATG patrols. Multiple downed American pilots owed their lives to these caches and to ATG rescue efforts. When aircraft went down in the wilderness, a common occurrence given the weather conditions and vast distances, ATG members were often the only people who could reach crash sites quickly and who had the survival skills to keep pilots alive until formal rescue operations could be organized.
In one of the more creative aspects of ATG operations, members in some villages constructed fake weapons and fortifications designed to fool Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Using barrels, logs, and other available materials, they built decoys that resembled artillery pieces and heavy weapons. From the air, these would appear to be legitimate military installations, hopefully deterring Japanese attack or causing them to overestimate American defensive strength. Whether this actually deterred any Japanese operations is unclear, but it demonstrated the ingenuity and resourcefulness of ATG members who were defending their communities with whatever means were available. What was it actually like to serve in the Alaska Territorial Guard? The experiences varied enormously depending on location, but certain elements were universal. Training. ATG members received basic military training adapted for Alaska conditions. This included military drill and organization, ship and aircraft identification, crucial for spotting enemy vessels, radio operation and protocols, weapons maintenance and marksmanship, patrol procedures, reporting protocols. For many Indigenous volunteers, the marksmanship training was almost superfluous. They'd been hunting since childhood and were already expert shots. Several ATG units demonstrated near-perfect accuracy in testing, with some individuals outperforming regular Army units.
The military organization and radio operation training, however, was entirely new for most volunteers. They had to learn military rank structures, command hierarchies, and the specific procedures for reporting intelligence through military channels. ATG members were issued a rifle, often older bolt-action models, though some units received better weapons, a uniform, snowshoes, and basic military gear. This was often supplemented by their own equipment, traditional cold-weather clothing, hunting gear, and survival tools that were far superior to military-issue equipment for operating in Arctic conditions. The contrast between military gear and traditional indigenous equipment highlighted a crucial reality. The U.S. military in 1942 was woefully unprepared for Arctic warfare. Indigenous peoples had clothing and equipment refined over thousands of years for surviving extreme cold. Military boots would freeze solid. Indigenous mukluks stayed flexible. Military sleeping bags were inadequate. Traditional fur blankets and sleeping arrangements were far superior. Major Marston's survival during his 680-mile dog sled recruitment mission was largely attributed to his willingness to abandon military survival procedures and completely adopt indigenous methods taught by his guide, Sammy Mogg. ATG units conducted regular patrols of assigned territories. These might be coastal patrols watching for submarines or landing craft, inland patrols checking on transportation routes and survival caches, or stationary observation posts monitoring sea and air approaches. Patrols in winter often meant traveling by dog sled across vast distances in brutal cold. Summer patrols might involve boats along the coast or hiking through difficult terrain. All required intimate knowledge of the land and exceptional survival skills. Young Sam Jackson, who later served in the Alaska National Guard after ATG service, recalled being assigned to help maintain blackout conditions in his village, making sure all windows were properly covered each night. "They told us to follow your training and it will save your life," he said of the Army instructors. "That's how we trained."
In many indigenous villages, the ATG service was a family and community affair. When Japanese threats intensified, entire communities mobilized. Women who weren't officially enlisted still contributed by maintaining communications, preparing supplies, caring for equipment, and serving as backup spotters and reporters. Stanley Rogers, a Vietnam War veteran from Bethel, recalled being related to probably 70 former ATG members. In small communities, the ATG wasn't a separate military unit. It was the community organized for defense. This family and community approach had advantages and disadvantages. The sense of collective purpose and mutual support was strong, but it also meant that fears and tensions affected entire communities, and the psychological burden of constant vigilance was shared by everyone, including children. While the ATG was organizing and beginning operations, the Japanese were entrenching themselves on Kiska and Attu. The occupation would last from June 7, 1942 until August 15, 1943, 433 days, during which the rising sun flag flew over American territory. The psychological impact of this occupation on Alaska's indigenous communities cannot be overstated. These were not abstract threats being reported in newspapers. These were enemy forces occupying islands that were part of their homeland, visible from some communities, reachable by traditional boats and known routes. Japanese forces on Attu had captured the entire Unangak's population and transported them to Japan as POWs. This was known among Alaska natives, and the fear that the same could happen to other communities was very real. Japanese submarines were regularly sighted off the coast. In some cases, Japanese officers actually came ashore and questioned locals about the economy, military presence, and population. These weren't covert operations. They were bold demonstrations that Japan could reach anywhere along Alaska's coast. The ATG's response was constant vigilance. Members were instructed that everyone was a sentry.
Any unusual activity was to be reported immediately. Communities developed reporting networks where information flowed from remote observers to village leaders to ATG commanders to military headquarters. Stanley Rogers later recounted stories from relatives about Japanese ships off the Bering Sea coast or of spies who had come ashore. Whatever they saw that was not appropriate, they would report it. The ATG's presence, thousands of indigenous defenders who knew every inlet, every beach, every route, made it virtually impossible for Japanese forces to expand their occupation without immediate detection. As Rogers put it, if the Japanese had invaded, they would have faced heavy resistance in a harsh land. They would have never made it. The ATG would have beaten them back. This wasn't just bravado. Indigenous Alaskans fighting in familiar territory with traditional survival skills would have been extraordinarily difficult for Japanese forces to defeat, even if the Japanese had numerical or technological superiority.
The Alaska Territorial Guard story cannot be told without addressing one of the most shameful episodes in American history: the forced evacuation and detention of the Unangaks, Aleut people, from the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands. When Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska, the U.S. military decided to evacuate other Aleut communities to prevent them from falling into enemy hands or being used as hostages. This might have been defensible as a military necessity, but the way it was carried out was unconscionable. Unangaks' families were given little to no notice. They were forced to board cramped transport ships with only what they could carry. Their homes and possessions were left behind, and in some cases, U.S. forces burned entire villages to prevent the buildings from being used by Japanese forces if they advanced further. The evacuees, 881 people from multiple communities, were transported to southeastern Alaska and placed in what can only be described as prison camps. They were housed in abandoned fish canneries, decrepit mine buildings, and other structures that were unsuitable for human habitation. The buildings were unsanitary, poorly heated, and overcrowded. Medical care was minimal. Food was inadequate. By the end of the war, approximately 100 of the 881 evacuees had died, more than 11% of the population. They died from diseases like tuberculosis that spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unhealthy conditions. They died from exposure and cold. They died from inadequate nutrition. Some died from simple hopelessness and despair at being torn from their homes and imprisoned by their own government. This happened while Unangaks men were volunteering for the ATG, while Indigenous Alaskans were defending U.S. territory without pay, while Native communities were sacrificing to protect America. The cruel irony was not lost on ATG members. They knew what was happening to their relatives and neighbors. They knew that while they were trusted to defend American soil, other Indigenous Alaskans were imprisoned precisely because they were Indigenous. This dual reality, Indigenous people as defenders and Indigenous people as prisoners, defined much of the ATG experience. They were fighting for a country that still didn't truly accept them, that would imprison their families based on nothing more than ethnicity and location, that would use their skills and sacrifice while denying them basic rights. Many ATG members had family in the evacuation camps. They served anyway, not because they loved or trusted the U.S. government, but because they loved their homeland and knew that if they didn't defend it, no one would. As the war progressed and it became clear that Japan was losing, Japanese military planners conceived a desperation weapon: fugo bombs, or fire balloons. These were hydrogen-filled balloons constructed from mulberry paper and konjac paste, measuring 33 feet in diameter. Each carried a 33-pound high-explosive bomb or multiple incendiary devices designed to start forest fires.
The balloons were launched from Japan and carried by the jet stream across the Pacific Ocean to North America. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched approximately 9,000 of these balloon bombs. About 1,000 are believed to have reached North America, with fragments found as far east as Michigan and as far south as Mexico, though most landed in Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, and Western Canada. The intent was to cause panic, start massive forest fires, and divert resources to domestic defense. The campaign largely failed because the U.S. government imposed a complete media blackout on the balloons. Without reports of their effectiveness, Japan had no way to know if the campaign was working and eventually abandoned it. But in Alaska, where many balloons landed, the ATG played a crucial role in the balloon bomb defense. ATG members spotted the balloons, tracked their landing sites, reported their locations, and in some cases engaged them to prevent their explosive payloads from detonating. The knowledge that Japanese weapons were literally falling from the sky across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, that the enemy could reach deep into U.S. territory even as they were losing the war, reinforced the ATG's sense of mission. The threat was real, ongoing, and required constant vigilance. Only one Fugo bomb caused American casualties during the war. On May 5, 1945, near Bly, Oregon, a minister's wife and 5 children on a Sunday school picnic discovered a balloon device in the woods. When they tried to move it, it exploded, killing all 6. They remain the only World War II combat deaths in the mainland United States. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, VE Day. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15, 1945, VJ Day, exactly 3 years and 1 month after the Japanese evacuated Kiska Island, ending their occupation of U.S. territory. For the ATG, the end of the war didn't mean an immediate end to operations. The organization continued until 1947, maintaining some level of territorial defense capability as Alaska transitioned back to peacetime conditions. But as military priorities shifted and regular forces returned to Alaska, the ATG was gradually disbanded. Members returned to their communities, to hunting and fishing, and trying to rebuild lives that had been disrupted by years of war. And then something inexcusable happened. They were forgotten. When the ATG was disbanded in 1947, its members received no formal recognition, no certificates of service, no veterans' benefits. They had served as unpaid volunteers in a military organization under Army command, but because they hadn't been formally enlisted as regular Army or National Guard, they weren't considered veterans. This might have been excusable as a bureaucratic oversight if it had been corrected quickly. Instead, for 53 years, the U.S. government denied ATG members veteran status and all the benefits that came with it. For decades, former ATG members tried to get recognition. They contacted senators and representatives. They shared their stories with anyone who would listen. They organized advocacy groups and pushed for legislative action. They were largely ignored. The reasons for this neglect are complex and shameful. Part of it was simple bureaucratic inflexibility. The ATG didn't fit neatly into existing categories of military service, and government agencies are notoriously resistant to creating new categories. Part of it was probably racial. Indigenous veterans of all U.S. wars have historically received less recognition and fewer benefits than white veterans, a pattern of discrimination that continues to this day. Part of it was geographical. Alaska itself was often forgotten or dismissed by federal policymakers in the lower 48 states. If regular Alaskans were overlooked, Indigenous Alaskans were doubly so. And part of it was the simple fact that the Alaska campaign has been largely written out of popular American World War II history. The focus has always been on Europe and the Pacific Island hopping campaigns. The fact that U.S. territory was invaded and occupied, that American civilians were held as POWs in Japan, that indigenous defenders organized to protect their homeland, these stories just didn't fit the preferred narrative of American military triumph.
In 2000, 55 years after World War II ended, President George W. Bush signed legislation granting veteran status to members of the Alaska Territorial Guard. The law ordered the Secretary of Defense to issue honorable discharges to ATG members, making them eligible for the same veterans benefits as other World War II service members: health care, burial benefits, commemorative medals, and others. But recognition came devastatingly late. By 2000, most ATG members had already died. Many had passed away in poverty without access to the medical care and financial support that veterans' benefits would have provided. Many died without ever receiving the honor and recognition they deserved for defending their homeland. Even after the 2000 legislation, implementation was slow and bureaucratic. The Department of Veterans Affairs had to track down surviving ATG members or their next of kin, verify service records that often didn't exist in official files, and process claims according to complex regulations. In 2013, 13 years after the law passed and 68 years after the war ended, NPR reported on VA officials traveling to Nome, Alaska, trying to register the few remaining ATG veterans. They met 82-year-old Laban Iatunguk, who had served as a teenager. When the VA sent Iatunguk registration papers, he received a bunch of papers, big brown envelope about an inch thick. He looked at the forms, became overwhelmed, just shoved the papers down under the TV, and they're still there. When VA officials came to Nome to help veterans complete the paperwork in person, Iatunguk attended a meeting at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall. But even with help available, he found the red tape daunting and walked out. "Oh, let 'em talk," he said as he crunched through the snow. His frustration was understandable. After serving without pay as a teenager to defend American territory, after waiting 55 years for recognition, he was now expected to navigate complex bureaucracy just to receive what should have been automatically granted decades earlier. As of 2013, the VA estimated that maybe 50 ATG veterans were still alive out of the original 6,300 plus. Each year, more passed away. The window for making things right was closing rapidly.
In recent decades, efforts have intensified to preserve and share ATG history before the last veterans pass away and living memory disappears. The Alaska National Guard Armory building in downtown Anchorage houses an extensive ATG exhibit. It includes photographs, uniforms, equipment, documents, and personal stories from ATG members. The museum works to collect oral histories and artifacts before they're lost. The Nome Convention and Visitors Bureau has exhibits on the ATG, particularly focusing on the role Nome area communities played in coastal defense. Throughout Alaska, small community museums in villages that had significant ATG participation have preserved local history through photographs, artifacts, and recorded memories. These smaller collections are often more detailed and personal than larger institutional holdings. Multiple organizations have worked to record interviews with surviving ATG members and their families. These oral histories capture details and perspectives that official records miss: the fear, the pride, the daily challenges, the community impact, and the personal sacrifices. The Alaska Veterans Memorial. In 2021, Alaska built a memorial honoring all Alaska veterans. The ATG is prominently featured, finally receiving the public recognition that was denied for so long.
One of the most frustrating aspects of ATG history is how thoroughly women's service was erased from official records. We know that at least 27 women served, that's the official count. But contemporary accounts, family stories, and photographic evidence suggest the real number was significantly higher. Women served as radiomen, scouts, observers, and in other roles. At least one woman outperformed male members in marksmanship tests. Women maintained communications equipment, served on observation posts, and participated in intelligence gathering. But because military bureaucracy in the 1940s was deeply sexist and often simply didn't know what to do with female volunteers, many women's service wasn't officially recorded. They weren't issued uniforms in some cases. Their names didn't make it onto rosters. When veteran status was finally granted in 2000, the difficulties in proving service were even greater for women whose contributions had been minimized or ignored from the start. Rediscovering and honoring these women veterans is ongoing work. Each discovered photograph, each family story, each oral history interview adds to the understanding of women's crucial role in Alaska's defense.
As of 2025, it's likely that no ATG veterans remain alive. The youngest recruits were around 12 to 15 in 1942, making them 95 to 98 years old today. The vast majority would have been older at recruitment and are long since gone. With their passing goes living memory, the direct connection to those who defended Alaska when the U.S. military couldn't or wouldn't. But their legacy endures. In the Alaska National Guard units that trace their lineage to the ATG, in the scout battalions that use techniques pioneered by ATG members, in the museums and memorials that preserve their stories, in the families who honor their ancestors' service, in the recognition, however late, that Indigenous Alaskans stepped forward when their homeland needed them. On June 7, 1942, when Japanese forces landed at Attu and Kiska and occupied American territory, the United States military was unprepared to defend Alaska's vast territory. Regular forces were desperately needed elsewhere. The Alaska National Guard had been pulled out of the territory. Military planners had written off Alaska as strategically irrelevant. In that moment of crisis, over 6,300 Indigenous Alaskans and some non-Indigenous Alaskans answered the call to defend their homeland. They formed the Alaska Territorial Guard, serving without pay, using traditional skills adapted for modern warfare, maintaining constant vigilance across thousands of miles of the harshest territory on Earth. They protected America's only Western Hemisphere platinum source. They secured the Lend-Lease air route that supplied vital aircraft to the Soviet Union. They provided intelligence on Japanese movements that conventional forces couldn't gather. They created survival systems that saved downed pilots' lives. They maintained defensive readiness across a coastline longer than the entire Atlantic seaboard. And they did it all while their relatives were imprisoned in detention camps, while their service was unpaid, while their contributions were minimized and forgotten. For 55 years after the war ended, they were denied veteran status. Most died without receiving the recognition they deserved. Even after the 2000 legislation, bureaucratic obstacles prevented many from receiving the benefits they'd earned. Their story has been footnoted, marginalized, almost erased from American World War II history. But the truth remains. When U.S. territory was occupied by enemy forces, when Alaska stood vulnerable and largely defenseless, when the military couldn't protect America's northern frontier, it was Indigenous Alaskans who became the shield. Major Marvin Muktuk Marston believed in them when the military establishment didn't. He traveled 680 miles by dog sled in brutal cold to recruit them.
He trusted them with the defense of American territory. They proved him right. The Alaska Territorial Guard defended America when America needed them most. They asked for no recognition, sought no glory, and received no pay. They simply did what needed to be done. They protected their home. That's the definition of heroism that history tried to forget, but that we must remember.